Once upon a time, in a bustling city teeming with life and noise, there lived a cat named Whisker. Whisker was not like the sleek, well-groomed felines that paraded in the windows of warm homes. He was a stray, his fur matted and gray from years of grime and weather. His emerald eyes, though still strikingly beautiful, bore the weight of countless sorrows. Whisker had been born in an alley behind a restaurant, the youngest of a litter of 4. His mother, a scrappy calico named Mistral, had done her best to care for her kittens. But life on the streets was unforgiving. Food was scarce, and danger lurked in every shadow. One by one, Whisker's siblings disappeared, some taken by illness, others claimed by the relentless traffic that roared through the city. By the time Whisker was 6 months old, he was alone. His mother had vanished one cold winter night, leaving Whisker to fend for himself. At first, he cried endlessly, his tiny mews echoing in the empty alley. But soon, he learned that tears would not fill his belly or protect him from harm. He hardened himself to the world, learning to survive on scraps and instinct. Years passed, and Whisker's life became a monotonous cycle of hunger and caution. The city, with its towering skyscrapers and endless crowds, was both his prison and his home. He roamed its streets, scavenging for food and avoiding humans, who either ignored him or shooed him away with disgust. Yet, amid the despair, Whisker found solace in small things: the warmth of the sun on a rare clear day, the gentle rustle of leaves in the park, and the occasional kindness of a stranger who left out a dish of milk or a piece of fish. One such stranger was an elderly woman named Clara. She lived in a small, run-down apartment on the outskirts of the city. Clara had a soft spot for strays, often leaving out bits of bread and water for the birds and cats that visited her tiny garden. Whisker was wary of her at first, watching from a distance as she shuffled outside with her offerings. But hunger eventually overpowered his fear, and he began to approach her cautiously. Clara noticed the ragged cat almost immediately. "Hello there," she said softly, her voice like the gentle rustle of leaves. "You look like you've been through a lot." She named him Whisker because of his unusually long, expressive whiskers. Though Whisker didn't understand her words, he felt the kindness in her tone. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to trust a human. Clara's garden became Whisker's sanctuary. She left out food for him every day and even placed an old blanket in a sheltered corner for him to sleep on. Whisker's fur began to regain some of its luster, and his eyes lost a bit of their haunted look. Clara's kindness was a balm to his weary soul, and for the first time in his life, he felt something akin to happiness. But life has a way of being cruel just when hope begins to bloom. One chilly autumn morning, Whisker arrived at the garden to find it empty. The usual bowl of food was missing, and the blanket had been tossed aside. Whisker meowed softly, his voice tinged with confusion. He prowled around the garden, searching for Clara, but she was nowhere to be found. Days turned into weeks, and Whisker's visits to the garden became more desperate. He meowed louder, hoping that Clara would hear him and return. But the windows of her apartment remained dark, and the garden stayed silent. Whisker didn't know that Clara had fallen ill and been taken to a hospital. Her frail body, worn down by age and hardship, could no longer fight the pneumonia that had gripped her. Without Clara, Whisker's world grew bleak once more. The streets, which had once felt a little less hostile, now seemed colder and more unforgiving. The other strays in the area, sensing his vulnerability, became more aggressive, often chasing him away from the few scraps of food he managed to find. Whisker's health began to deteriorate. His once bright eyes grew dull, and his movements became sluggish. One rainy evening, as Whisker huddled under a parked car to escape the downpour, he thought of Clara. He remembered the warmth of her hands as she gently patted his head, the soothing sound of her voice as she spoke to him. The memory was a small comfort, a flicker of light in the darkness that surrounded him. But even the brightest memories cannot keep the cold at bay. Winter arrived, harsh and unrelenting. The snow fell in thick, heavy sheets, blanketing the city in white. For a stray cat like Whisker, it was a death sentence. Food became almost impossible to find, and the freezing temperatures sapped what little strength he had left. Whisker's days became a blur of hunger and cold, his body weakening with each passing moment. One fateful night, as the city prepared to celebrate the new year, Whisker found himself on the steps of a grand building. It was a bustling venue, filled with people in elegant clothes and glittering jewelry. Music and laughter spilled out into the cold night air. Whisker's thin frame shivered as he gazed at the warm glow of the lights inside. He meowed weakly, his voice barely audible over the noise. A child, dressed in a fancy coat, noticed him. "Look, Mommy, a kitty," she exclaimed, tugging at her mother's hand. The woman glanced at Whisker, her expression a mixture of pity and distaste. "Poor thing," she murmured. "But don't touch it, sweetie. It might be sick." She hurried her child inside, leaving Whisker alone in the snow. Whisker's legs gave out, and he collapsed on the icy steps. His breaths came in shallow gasps, his body too weak to move. As he lay there, the world around him began to blur. The laughter and music faded into a distant hum, replaced by a profound silence. Whisker closed his eyes, surrendering to the darkness. In his final moments, Whisker dreamed of Clara. He imagined her warm hands lifting him up, her soft voice telling him he was a good boy. He dreamed of her garden, bathed in sunlight, and the comforting scent of the blanket she had given him. In his dream, he was no longer a stray, but a beloved companion, cherished and safe. When the clock struck midnight and the city erupted in cheers and fireworks, Whisker took his last breath. His small body lay still on the steps, unnoticed by the revelers inside. But Whisker's story did not end there. The next morning, a young journalist named Ellie stumbled upon Whisker's lifeless form. She had been covering the New Year's celebrations and was on her way home when she saw the little cat on the steps. Something about him, the way his body seemed so fragile, the faint trace of a life that had fought so hard, stirred something deep within her. Ellie took a photograph of Whisker, intending to write a small piece about the plight of stray animals in the city. But as she sat down to write, the story took on a life of its own. She wrote about Whisker's struggles, his brief moments of happiness with Clara, and the heartbreak of his lonely death. She poured her heart into the article, determined to give voice to a life that had gone unnoticed. When the story was published, it struck a chord with readers. People from all walks of life were moved by Whisker's tale. Influential figures, from politicians to celebrities, began advocating for better treatment of stray animals. Donations poured into animal shelters, and initiatives were launched to provide food, medical care, and shelter for the countless strays that roamed the city. Clara, who had recovered from her illness and was living in a care home, read the article with tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Whisker," she whispered, clutching the newspaper to her chest. "You've changed the world, my sweet boy." Though Whisker was gone, his story lived on, inspiring compassion and change. And in the hearts of those who read about him, the ragged little cat with the emerald eyes found a home at last.